It had been exactly 76 hours since the human fleet had sent their data pulse to the Columba fleet, and at that point, the Columba fleet had gone completely dark. As the ships advanced, they began to scan across each of the ships, some of which were still moving as some of their ports had completely blown open, and in some cases one was still spinning like a top as it drifted farther and farther away from the rest. Several of the captains figured they would use it for target practice, as it was going to be kind of difficult to grab a hold of something that was spinning like that in the vacuum of space. They scanned each of the vessels, reading for any energy signature or heat signature from the engines. Nothing. The weapons were not charged. Life support was non-existent. And hearing this, each of the planet commanders began to argue about salvage rights. Of course, this was all for show, as they knew exactly where the entire fleet was going. They grabbed each of them and started to take them to the new station that was built near Io specifically to strip and refit these vessels. This station was specifically constructed to make sure humanity didn't just tear each other apart like starving dogs at a dump. This still did not stop them from trying to call dibs on certain vessels, although everybody realized this was more of a joke than anything else. Every ship would keep their scanners on high, just in case, as each ship was attached and towed to the station. Once at the station, the workers of Io began to get going, and they were very, very good. Think of it as an intergalactic chop shop. Once the ship itself was actually secured, the first thing was getting inside without damaging the hull too much. This used to take about 90 minutes in a cutting torch, but now they knew what they were doing more. Now they would open a panel on the outside, and they were able to crank open the doors manually. This was only done if a ship had not already been breached. If so, they just entered through the breach and made sure that it was completely sealed before anyone else continued on. They need to make sure that it's a very good seal, because they knew who was coming after them. This is where things get interesting, as several teams enter in a systematic fashion. The security teams are sent in to assure that the crew is fully deceased. They have specialized tools to assure that they can get past any door, hatch, or bulkhead without causing too much more damage. In spite of their very delicate approach, they still search with really big weapons, just in case. Behind them, once they cleared it, was the cleanup crew. It was their job to remove the bodies and parts of bodies and smears of bodies and bring them to the processing center. It turns out the snake portion of the caldera turns out to be quite tasty, especially when cooked with mushrooms, onions, garlic, and just a pinch of oregano. Although, if you have leeks, oh boy, people will end up licking the plate clean after that one. In spite of the idea of snagging something that was going to make you drool thinking about how it's going to cook, there was one position no one liked. In fact, they hated it. Usually, it was the FNG, the new guy, or somebody who got in trouble who was forced to go into the snake's version of a laboratory and clear it out. Everyone laughed, as there was always a turd or two floating around in zero-G, with a few more stuck frozen to the walls. No one enjoyed this detail. Once the ship had been cleared, checked, and cleaned, of course, the next group to come across were the engineers, who had to salvage all the intel while simultaneously trying to scrub the system. The problem was to assure the snakes didn't find their way to bypass the capture programs. There was no back door in these programs at all. Thankfully, just like jujitsu, there's always a counter to a counter to a counter. They quite literally created a virus that would kill all the other viruses. The level of degradation to the enemy files really depended on what the crew had done or didn't do to stop the virus before the ship itself went dark. Once the ship was completely cleared of hostile forces, biological contaminants, and computer tech was taken care of, there was when the hard part starts. You see, the internals of the ships had to be stripped down to their base components. The reason being is that new computers had to be installed, and also more items that were more suited for humans. One of the top priorities was chairs, as the Columbra don't actually sit down. If anything, they coil onto themselves. The station itself had grown so large over the years, as its primary mission was to harvest gases from Jupiter and process ore from the asteroid belt, so it just continued to grow. It was now so large that it could perform its insane dance of recovery, repair, recommission with 7 ships at a time, although provided they were some of the smaller ships, as, let's face it, mass is still mass. While they worked, inventories were taken, resources divided, barter over salvage commenced. Everything was divided by population, of course, meaning Earth always got the lion's share, yet they had made a point to give some of their extra to the colonies, as they would end up needing it more. If there was any type of invasion, they would always aim for the weakest point first. It's very rare that they would try to bypass that, leaving their flanks open. Corporations also began to try and purchase items, though they had to be very careful, as smuggling anything would leave some of the worst consequences a company could possibly have. They all had to remind it of what happened to the oligarchs that had decided to bury themselves into the mantle of the planet during the first invasion and simply tell everyone to go and fight for their purpose. Instead, they stayed in luxury while everyone else suffered. Well, they did not like what they found when they were finally yanked out of their bunkers by force. Right around reaching 19% of the fleet being completely cleansed and refit and then sent out, everybody received a shock. They all heard the same thing over the comms. "We found one alive!" They were all shocked. Is this even possible? As it turns out, when the young snake saw the humans, he was so grateful to see another living creature, he simply passed out. They found him inside a cruiser, of all things, and he was stuck in a large galley type area alone. This gave him enough time, as there was plenty of air for him to breathe, to figure out some way to keep airflow going. As it turns out, he was able to rig up something keeping the food fresh to recycle air. And of course, he had plenty of food, but water, on the other hand, no. Without electricity, nothing was moving, none of the pipes. By the time they got to the young male and got him out of the ship, he had actually slipped into a coma, mainly due to lack of water and being on the edge of hibernation due to the cold for at least a week now. The search teams had renewed vigor, as they then took special care when clearing a ship. Yet, if they could find another one alive, they would boast about it for years. So they wanted to do this much faster, but they couldn't sacrifice making sure that everywhere was clear. When they had finally got around to the enemy dreadnought and actually got it to the station, as that was something that had to be towed in by some of the largest ships humans had, no one would have believed they would find another one alive. Turns out, one of these medics turned out to be a very clever snake in the grass. He had used the residual charge from their stasis pods to sleep most of the way. He had been out for days at this point. These pods were only meant to be used for steaming your staff, but since he was stuck in 0G with no way out of the infirmary, everybody figured he just went, fuck it. With the pod's power exhausted, he was able to stay alive by opening one of the gas cylinders, one right after another, to keep a breathable atmosphere, though eventually it was going to be getting very thin in there, and highly pressurized as that. However, he might have been low, but he hadn't run out yet. His main issue was food and water. When he was found, he was so dehydrated and emaciated that he could barely even move, as he could feel them place his hands in some sort of strange plastic restraints. He didn't slip into a coma as the other one did, but he just could not move anymore. The word of survivors ran through the fleet, and rumors reached Earth long before the official word was actually released. It was only confirmed once they could confirm that both survivors would actually survive. It was touch and go for a while. When it became official, there was a major in the fleet that let his own thoughts leak out into his words as he said, "I wonder what she'll say about this." His crew looked at him weird, and he continued on. Along with the two prisoners, the collections of materials was quite substantial, not counting everything they found as far as ground vehicles, any type of equipment that might be in there, just in ships. They had dreadnought class numbering of 1, battleship class 3, cruiser class 28, destroyer class 69, frigate class 51, and corvette class 80. The dreadnought is going to protect Earth, obviously, and the battleships are going to be split across Sols 2, 3, and 4, obviously Venus, Earth, and Mars. The cruisers will be sent as protection fleets for the colony worlds, and destroyers and frigates will be divided across all sectors, depending on their population. Corvette classes are to be sold off to increase production, and this is mainly due to the fact that the majority of the Corvette class that showed up are not outfitted for combat. These idiots came up just to watch the fight. Morons. Before each ship leaves Io, they're all redesignated for their intended purpose. Since Earth is the only one that's actually stable as far as the economy goes, all the rest of them decided that most of their cruisers, destroyers, and frigates are going to be stripped down and turned into cargo haulers. Though they will not be defenseless by any means, they will have their fixed main guns removed. Though there was a secondary reason why this, and that is because looking over the main guns, all the engineers all said the exact same thing as they analyzed it. Seriously? This is it? Even though it wasn't much of a battle at all, they did successfully protect Sol Sector once again, and now they know exactly what the enemy would have in their disposal. Not only were the ship's design known because they had been stripping them apart for the past few weeks, they now had 93% of the enemy computer systems, at least those that were sent. With this, it was easy to know exactly how many warriors, ships, stations, colonies, planets, and their tactics. The numbers, however, made every tactician realize that they had been thrown into the very deep end of the pool on this one. The enemy's numbers were simply staggering compared to humanity. They triple checked them for accuracy, but it still made everybody raise their pucker factor over 9,000. Everyone knew what they had to do at this point. Prepare. In a facility in the heartland of North America, personnel watched as a shuttle slowly came down. They had to stay farther back as the fusion torches scorched the landing pad on its final approach. Good thing that the landing pad's actually designed exactly to handle that sort of thing. Once it landed, it only took a few moments before the doors began to open, and once they were fully out, two very large gurneys were wheeled off with personnel strapped to them. Flanked on either side was extremely heavy security, most of which were in exosuits. Neither of the two snakes that were on the gurneys were healthy enough to move and had to be wheeled in this way. As they were wheeled into the facility, a young lady was waiting, and when they rolled up to the gurneys, they seemed to flank her on either side, seeming to split the difference around her. The director stopped them for a moment simply by raising his hand. The young lady reached over to each of them and looked into their eyes while squeezing their hands. They both turned and seemed to mumble something, almost like it was the same thing, but so low that the translator just couldn't pick it up. As she slowly released, the males were then sent to the containment area. The director and Susan walked over and stood next to the young lady as she had spun around to watch the two be wheeled down the hall. She knew she couldn't follow, she wasn't allowed. The director, without looking at her, what did they say? They thought they died, the young lady said. Susan chimed in, So that they said they died? It didn't sound like that to me. The director turned to the young lady who was still looking down the hallway. What did they actually say? They said, Angel.